This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 153 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we're going to look at 4 laws of learning and how you can obey them in your classroom. Teaching is a complex, multifaceted, dynamic profession. New ideas, new tools, and new strategies are coming at you all the time. On top of that, changing circumstances compel you to make adjustments to the way you normally do things. With all of this spinning around you, it can be hard to find a clear path. There are so many factors that impact student learning, but when it comes to planning lessons, that 45 to 90-minute block of time set aside for instruction, what activities really move the needle on learning? To make those instructional decisions, it helps to have a compass, a set of principles you can return to again and again when you start to feel like you're losing your way. That's what I have for you today. I looked at the research and managed to condense what I found into 4 laws of learning, broad guidelines that define solid teaching practices. I'm certainly not the first person to do this. John Hattie's work to rank various influences on student achievement has been groundbreaking, but I have often felt confused about what some of his terms actually mean. Plus, every time I mention him, I am met with fierce pushback from some people whose understanding of statistics is clearly way more sophisticated than mine. There's also Robert Marzano's high yield strategies, which I'm a big fan of, but I've learned a few things over the last few years that aren't covered by those. So I'm offering my own list. Shorter than Marzano's, a lot shorter than Hattie's, and not nearly as comprehensive, but they're good, and they're backed by research. I am not putting these out there as the 4 laws. They're not the last word on teaching or the only thing you should ever consider when planning a lesson, but they are heavy hitters. And if you find yourself feeling unsure about how to choose between all the different approaches and tools, returning to these 4 principles will absolutely put you on solid ground. Before we start, I want to thank Pear Deck for sponsoring this episode. One of the reasons I love Pear Deck is because it was founded by educators who have designed the products to support instructional best practices known to improve student outcomes. Pear Deck gives teachers real-time insight into student thinking and understanding so they can react as necessary and seize teachable moments. Better yet, Pear Deck's seamless integration with Google Slides and Microsoft PowerPoint make it easy to build interactive presentations that generate 100% student engagement. And great news, Pear Deck is offering Cult of Pedagogy listeners 60 days premium access for free. Just visit peardeck.com/cultofpedagogy to get started. Support also comes from UL Explore Labs. UL Explore Labs inspires secondary students to solve global safety and sustainability issues through science. This free online teaching resource explores battery energy and fire through 3 modules. The phenomena of thermal runaway in lithium-ion batteries, mobile phone battery supply chain and the issue of e-waste, and a fire forensics investigation unit where students investigate how and where a kitchen fire started. UL Explore Labs invites students to exercise their reasoning skills and sparks curiosity through interactive videos, hands-on activities, and virtual self-guided lessons. Today's students are tomorrow's problem solvers for a safer, more sustainable world. Visit ulexplorelabs.org, spelled ULXPLORLABS, for these free resources. Now, let's talk about these 4 laws of learning. In this episode, I am just going to give you a quick summary of the 4 laws and offer some quick tips on implementing them in your classroom. But if you're interested in what you hear and you want to really learn this stuff well, you will want to check out my brand new mini course called 4 Laws of Learning. It's a self-paced, video-based course that goes more in depth on these principles. It includes a lot more research, and it offers supplementary materials like guided notes that you can work with while you watch the module videos, a quiz after each module to check your understanding, reflections at the end of each module to help you make specific plans for implementing the laws in your own practice, and a 22-page PDF of summary notes that includes all the key points from the course. The course is available to single users, groups of 5 or 10, and there's even an option to get a whole school license if you want it for every teacher in your building. And my listeners can get $5 off the course tuition by using the promo code LISTENER at checkout. The course is live now. Go check it out at cultofpedagogy.com/laws, LAWS. So the first law is, this is number 1, keep the GPS on. When we go on a trip, many of us use GPS navigation systems, which give us precise information about the route we should follow and how long it'll take to get there. These systems give us constant updates along the way, so we always know how much progress we're making. As teachers, whether or not we provide instructional GPS can make a huge difference in how well our students learn. For best results, our instructional GPS should be on in these ways. First is with learning goals and success criteria. Regularly communicating both learning goals and success criteria so that students know exactly where they're headed and what it'll look like when they reach the goal is really important to help them learn. Multiple studies report that achievement increases significantly when students understand the learning goals and the criteria for success. So to do this, here's a couple of tips. One is to make sure that you write your learning goals in age-appropriate language. Post them somewhere that students can see them and refer to them before, during, and after your lessons. Another tip, use rubrics to spell out the success criteria for assignments. I've talked a lot about the single point rubric in my podcasts and interviews and stuff. Those work really well for complex assignments. And then another way to communicate the success criteria to students is to show them models of different levels of success. So for any type of a project or assignment that is, more than just a worksheet, showing them what it looks like to get a good score versus a not so good score helps to give students a clearer picture of what it takes. So that's the first way of keeping the GPS on, just by communicating learning goals and success criteria. Another way is through formative assessment. Now, the research on formative assessment tells us that if we improve it, it leads to learning improvements for all students and reduces gaps between low and high achievers. So 2 tips for formative assessment. One is be sure that you're actually making your formative assessment formative. Sometimes I've heard of teachers that will give a quiz and then take 2 weeks to grade it. This is a measurement tool that we need to use to make instructional decisions. Also, it really shouldn't count toward a student's grade. If it's truly formative, if we're just checking for student understanding, then this is not something that students should be penalized for in terms of their grade. Also, conduct formative assessment in a variety of ways. You can use quizzes, exit slips, class polls, even think, pair, shares are all ways of formatively assessing student understanding. So the final way to keep that GPS on is with effective feedback. Feedback is most effective when it draws attention to positive elements of student performance, when it actually addresses the success criteria that you covered with students earlier, when it includes specific advice on improvement, when it's given in small, manageable units, and when it's given soon after the student attempts the task. So in a recent podcast episode, I interviewed Matt Johnson about flash feedback. and he taught us some really good techniques for giving more feedback in less time. So I would advise you to go back and do that. And by the way, everything I mentioned here, if you go to cultofpedagogy.com, click on podcasts, and go to episode 153, you're going to find all this stuff, links to everything. So I'm not going to dig up all of the numbers of the podcast episodes because it would be a lot. Another thing about feedback is that when you give grades and feedback, students tend to ignore the feedback and just look at the grade. So another strategy that I share a link to in the post was one that was given to me by a high school English teacher named Christy Loudon, and she called it delaying the grade, where she's got this system for giving students feedback on their assignments before they see the grade so that they pay closer attention to that feedback. So that's law number 1, keep the GPS on. Do everything that you can to make sure students understand the goals, the criteria, and that you are regularly formatively assessing them and giving them feedback so that they know how they're doing. Law number 2 is classify, connect, and compare. As we learn, our brains are wired to group things into categories. When new information comes in, we sort it, compare it, and try to make sense of it based on similar characteristics. If we can work with this natural tendency in our teaching, we will boost student learning. So a couple of strategies that I recommend for putting this law into practice. One is called the concept attainment strategy. This is where you have students study yes and no examples of a concept until they can begin to define that concept, and then refine their definition by looking at more examples. So in the post, I've got a link to an article about the concept attainment strategy. And that's a really good one for sort of big concepts that are really hard to pin down with a simple definition. Another really useful tool for having students classify, connect, and compare is graphic organizers. Using these naturally gets students to do all of these things. For graphic organizers to work best, though, you should be explaining their purpose, modeling their use, and if you're covering very complex material, partially complete them before you have students start to work on them so that they have a clear idea of how to use them. In the post, I've got a link to a pretty comprehensive article about graphic organizers that includes all the research about them and some different ways to use those. The last strategy that follows this law of classify, connect, and compare is called inductive learning. This strategy has students take a big pile of chunks of content and they have to sort it into categories, and it's categories of their own making, and they've got to then label the categories based on how they sorted out these things. The purpose of this is to sort of get them thinking about the content before they do formal learning of it. It's a constructivist activity. So once their minds have been primed from doing this work, then they're presented with the content in a more traditional way. But this gives them a chance to sort of wrestle with it a little bit and try to figure it out before they actually learn it. So as with the other two strategies, I've got a link to an article about inductive learning also. So just go to Cult of Pedagogy podcast and click episode 153. You'll go to the blog post with all the links. So law 1 was keep the GPS on. Law 2, classify, connect, and compare. Law 3 is to learn, we need to churn. Between the time when we introduce skills and knowledge to students and the time when we assess their mastery of those skills and knowledge, they need to process that material in some way. Some lesson plans call this processing guided practice or independent practice. And these terms make sense if we're talking about skills. They are less logical with knowledge-based content because you can't practice information, but students still need to interact in some way with the material they learn. So to cover all bases, I'm going to use the term churn, which is the act of agitating or breaking something up like liquid in a blender. If we want students to learn something well, we need to give them an opportunity to churn that material up in some way. There are a lot of different ways to provide this churn. Here are just a few. One is with movement. Adding gestures to learning activities results in more enduring learning, and any kind of physical activity is correlated with improved academic performance. So in the post, I've linked to another blog post that covers many different ways to add movement to instruction. Another way to add churn is with note-taking. There's a lot of research that supports the use of note-taking to boost learning. So if you're not already having your students doing any kind of note-taking, this should be the year that you start implementing it in some ways. Also, to make it most effective, teach your students how to take notes rather than just expecting that they already know how. It's not an inborn skill. The last way that I'm going to suggest that you provide churn is through any kind of cooperative learning activity. Having students work cooperatively consistently yields higher levels of achievement than either competitive or independent learning. Some great cooperative learning strategies are Jigsaw, and I've got a link to a whole post that teaches you how to do that. Another one called reciprocal learning, where students basically work in pairs and one student has one set of problems, another student has a different set, and they have the answers to each other's problems, so they coach each other. They're not supposed to give the answers to each other, but they're coaching each other to work on these problems. And the last cooperative learning strategy is something really simple that I call chat stations. This is basically a way of turning a worksheet into an interactive class activity where you break up a set of questions into tiny little posters all around your room, and you send students around in groups to respond to them, and then you come back together as a class and discuss them. And by the way, now that I'm talking about chat stations, I'm remembering that in the course that I mentioned, because right now so many of you are teaching remotely or you're teaching in highly socially distanced classrooms, in the mini course, I've actually got a section at the end of every module that goes over specific tools that you can use in remote learning situations to make all of these different strategies work in online teaching. So the 3 laws so far: number 1, keep the GPS on. Number 2, classify, connect, and compare. Law 3, to learn, we need to churn. And then law 4 is better to retrieve than receive. In so many teaching situations, our instinct is often to push information into students' brains. And although it's absolutely necessary for students to take in the material in order to learn it and to churn it, as we just covered in Law 3, once that information has been delivered and processed, there are other things we can do to make sure that information is locked into long-term memory. Unfortunately, when it's time to study our material, like to review it for a test, what many teachers and students tend to do is simply reread it. Teachers prepare study guides with bulleted lists or study concepts, and students review their notes or readings. A much more effective approach to studying is retrieval practice, which I have talked about many times on this podcast. Retrieval practice is the act of recalling information without the aid of a text. In other words, quizzing ourselves on the material. The more we can build retrieval practice into our instruction, the better our students will get at recalling the information and concepts we're trying to teach them. So I've got a link in the post to probably the main article that I've written about retrieval practice. But real quick, here's 3 simple ways to add more retrieval practice into your classroom. One is to give more low stakes quizzes. And by low stakes, I mean either no grade or very, very minimal grade. And doing regular quizzing on the course material actually helps students learn the material better. The act of being quizzed helps them learn it better. Another way is through flashcards. We need to teach our students how to actually create and study them. But then once they've learned, you can create them, you can share decks with them, and set aside class time so that students can actually study flashcards as well. Finally, there are brain dumps. This is where you give students a few minutes to write down everything they can remember about a topic they've learned in your class. And then, if you have time, let them check their response for accuracy and completeness by looking at the text or comparing notes with a classmate or both. So those are the 4 laws. Keep the GPS on, classify, connect, and compare. To learn, we need to churn, and better to retrieve then receive. Like I said before, these are not the only laws about teaching, but if you're starting to feel yourself in kind of a tailspin and getting a little bit lost about what you should be doing in the classroom, this is a really good list of basics to pull yourself back to. And if you can stick to those and include those things in your lessons, then you will definitely be on the right track. For links to all the resources mentioned in this episode, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 153. And to check out my new mini course, 4 Laws of Learning, visit cultofpedagogy.com/laws, LAWS, and remember to use the code LISTENER at checkout to get $5 off the course tuition. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day.